Karen called the cops on a black man sitting too long. He was writing a book on racism. Chapter 1. The Man on the Bench. On a warm Thursday morning in Maplewood Heights, the park was quiet, save for the rustling of sycamore leaves and the chirps of ambitious sparrows. At the far edge of the green, where sunlight filtered through an old elm, sat Clarence Miles, a black man in his late 60s, dressed in a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a navy cap embroidered with the words Fisk University, Class of '78. He sat on the same wooden bench every morning with a thick black moleskin notebook on his lap and a fountain pen in his hand. Sometimes he'd stare into the trees for long stretches. Other times his hand would glide across the page with slow, thoughtful strokes. What no one knew was that Clarence wasn't just writing. He was reclaiming. Each page held parts of his life he'd never dared to speak aloud. Until now. His memoir, To Sit and Be Seen, was a project 30 years in the making. The park bench had become his sacred writing ground. But to one woman across the path, the stillness of Clarence was not poetic. It was suspicious. Chapter 2. The Watcher in the Pink Windbreaker. Karen Billingsley, age 54, was brisk walking her way through her second lap around the park, wearing a neon pink windbreaker and matching visor. Her Fitbit buzzed triumphantly. She noticed Clarence on her first lap and frowned slightly. By the second lap, she slowed down. He was still there, still writing, still not moving. Karen didn't like things that didn't move, or rather people who lingered too long in places where she believed they didn't belong. She pulled out her phone and took a slow photo of Clarence's back, just in case, she told herself. Then she dialed 911. Chapter 3. The call, 911. What's your emergency? Karen spoke in a hushed, urgent tone. Yes, I'm in Maplewood Park, and there's a man. He's been sitting on the same bench for almost an hour. Just sitting, writing something. What is he doing that concerns you, ma'am? I don't know, but it looks odd. He hasn't moved. He's watching people. Writing. It just feels off. Is he threatening anyone? No, but he's making others uncomfortable. I think he's watching the kids on the playground. In truth, Clarence hadn't looked at the playground once. But perception, when tainted by fear, has no use for truth. Chapter 4. Blue and white Clarence was writing about a childhood memory in Birmingham. He was 8, sitting at a lunch counter next to his mother when a man in a uniform told them to move. He was deep into the memory when he heard the voice. Sir, can we talk to you for a moment? Clarence looked up and saw 2 officers, one male, one female. Blue uniforms, cautious eyes. Of course, he said, closing his notebook slowly. Is something wrong? We got a call. Said you've been sitting here a while. Writing. Clarence blinked. Is there a time limit on sitting quietly now? The male officer shifted. No, sir, but we had to check. Some people get concerned. Clarence nodded slowly. People always seem concerned when I'm still, or silent, or breathing. The female officer's eyes softened. May I ask what you're writing? Clarence smiled faintly. A book, about this exact moment, and all the moments that led to it. HOA, Chapter 5. The Ripple. The exchange would have ended there, except a teenage girl nearby had been filming everything. She uploaded the clip to TikTok with the caption, Karen strikes again. This time it's a writer on a bench. By nightfall, the video had gone viral. Hashtags exploded. Rashar bench while black. Rashar let him write. Rashar Hokarin. Dasha Clarence was writing. Evening news outlets picked up the story. Within 24 hours, Clarence's name and book title were trending nationally. But he hadn't posted a word. Chapter 6. A knock at her door. The next morning, Karen opened her front door to find 3 things. A newspaper with Clarence's photo on the front. A handwritten note from a neighbor. Maybe think before you dial next time. An HOA complaint against her. Apparently, someone had filed a formal grievance citing disruption of public peace based on unfounded suspicion. Karen's face flushed. She was the one used to filing complaints, not receiving them. That afternoon, she turned on the TV and saw Clarence on a news segment. He sat calmly reading from his journal. When a black man sits too long, people assume he's plotting. When he walks too fast, they assume he's running. When he simply exists, they assume it's a threat. Ashuri, Karen turned the TV off. For the first time, the silence in her house felt like it was about her. Chapter 7. The Interview Request. Clarence was sipping coffee on his porch when a silver sedan pulled up. A young journalist stepped out. Amira Blake, from The Atlantic. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced, Mr. Miles," she said, "but I read your chapter online, the one from the bench. I think it's brilliant." Clarence raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know it was online. Your nephew shared a page on Twitter. It's beautiful. May I interview you?" Clarence invited her in. They spoke for hours. About writing, about dignity, about what it means to be seen too much and heard too little. When Amira left, Clarence felt something he hadn't in years. Read. Chapter 8. Karen at the meeting. Karen walked into the HOA meeting hoping to deflect. Instead, Harold, the HOA president, called her out first thing. "We've had complaints about misuse of emergency services," he said, "particularly targeting residents who haven't broken a single rule." Karen stood flustered. "I was only trying to be cautious." Harold didn't flinch. "Caution is when someone's doing harm. Prejudice is when someone's just writing." Some clapped, some didn't. But Karen felt something she never had in that room before. Isolation. She sat down, cheeks burning. Chapter 9. Clarence's Speech. A week later, the city invited Clarence to speak at the Maplewood Voices event, a community forum about inclusion and awareness. He took the stage slowly, notebook in hand. "I've been sitting on benches my whole life," he said, "sometimes waiting for buses, sometimes waiting for fairness." The room was silent. "And last week I was told I'd been sitting too long, that my stillness was discomforting, that my words might be dangerous." He smiled softly. "But that's the funny thing about stories. They don't stop because you're afraid of them. They only grow louder." Chapter 10. The Turning Point. Karen didn't attend the event, but she watched it online. Then she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She walked to the park. Clarence was there, writing, as always. Karen stood awkwardly beside the bench. "I judged you," she said quietly, "and I was wrong." Clarence looked up, pen still in hand. "You did." Karen bit her lip. "I thought I was keeping the neighborhood safe." He nodded. "From me." She looked away, then sat down next to him. "I'd like to read your book," she whispered. Clarence said nothing, but he didn't ask her to leave. Chapter 11. An Empty Apology. The day after Karen sat on the bench next to Clarence, she wrote him a letter. It was short, typed, and printed on her best stationery. "Mr. Miles, I want to sincerely apologize for misjudging you. I allowed fear and assumption to cloud my better instincts. I am trying to do better. If there's any way I can help, I'd like to offer my support. Respectfully, Karen Billingsley." She folded it carefully, slid it into an envelope, and dropped it in his mailbox. Clarence read it that evening, standing by his kitchen window with tea in hand. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply slid the letter into the same notebook he'd been writing his memoir in. A new chapter began. The Apologies That Come Too Late. Chapter 12. From page to publisher. Clarence's story was no longer just his own. Within days of the viral moment, agents had begun calling. Most were performative, offering quick deals to capture the moment. But one stood out. Jillian Moritz, an editor from a small Black-owned publishing house in D.C. She called Clarence directly. "I don't want a headline," she said. "I want your full truth. Not just the bench, everything." Clarence said nothing for a few moments. Then, "Come to Maplewood. Meet me on the bench." She arrived 2 days later, sat beside him, and listened for hours. She left with a handwritten manuscript in her backpack and tears in her eyes. Chapter 13. Karen's Silence Grows Loud. In the weeks that followed, Karen found herself increasingly alone. Neighbors waved less. Some didn't wave at all. She overheard 2 teens call her the woman who called the cops on a writer. The HOA quietly removed her from 2 volunteer committees to prevent conflict. But the real punishment wasn't social, it was internal. At night, she'd lie awake replaying Clarence's calm voice asking, From me? She looked in the mirror one morning and whispered, "Who have I been?" Chapter 14. Clarence on NPR. One crisp afternoon, Clarence sat at his dining table with a small microphone clipped to his lapel. An NPR journalist leaned in across the table. "You've become the face of something much larger than a bench," she said. Clarence smiled faintly. "I never asked to be the face of anything. I just wanted to sit and write." "But the message resonated, especially with the title of your book." Clarence nodded. "To sit and be seen." It came from the idea that sometimes just sitting in peace is a kind of protest. He paused, then added, "And a kind of hope." Harmona Chapter 15, The Bookstore Window. Weeks later, Maplewood's local bookstore featured Clarence's book cover in the window. Large, bold print beneath it read, "A memoir the world needs right now, the New York Times." The town buzzed. Book clubs formed. Students quoted him in essays. Even the mayor invited him to speak at City Hall. Clarence politely declined, preferring to stay where he always belonged, on the bench. Still, his presence felt larger than ever. Each time he sat down, people paused, not out of suspicion, but out of respect. Chapter 16. Karen's daughter speaks. Karen's daughter, Rachel, visited from Chicago. They hadn't spoken since the incident went public. Over tea, Rachel brought it up directly. "You became a meme, Mom." Karen looked down. "I know. You called the police on a man for sitting." "I didn't know who he was." Rachel frowned. "That's the problem. You didn't care who he was." Karen swallowed hard. "I was scared." "No, Mom. You were conditioned to be scared." Karen said nothing for a long time. "I'm not asking you to fix everything," Rachel continued. "But if you really want to change, it starts with listening. And it doesn't stop when people stop looking." Chapter 17. Letters from Strangers. Clarence's publisher started forwarding him letters. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Readers from across the country wrote, "Your story made me confront my own silence. Thank you for putting into words what I felt my whole life. I used to think I was nothing. You helped me feel seen." One letter came from a woman in her 70s. "I once called the police on a young man walking past my window. I never learned his name. I thought I was protecting myself. Now I think I was protecting a lie. Thank you for helping me break it." Clarence folded that letter and tucked it next to Karen's. Chapter 18. Karen's Real Apology. One afternoon, as leaves began falling and the park turned golden, Karen approached the bench again. This time she brought no letters, no clipboard, no nervous smile, just herself. She sat beside Clarence, slowly. He looked up from his notebook but didn't speak. Karen stared ahead. "I've been reading your book," she said, "and I realized the first apology I gave you was about me." Clarence didn't reply. Karen continued, "I want to offer one that's actually about you." She turned to face him. "I'm sorry for trying to erase your stillness, for treating your presence like a problem, for thinking my discomfort mattered more than your dignity. I didn't just call the police. I called my fear, and I'm ashamed." Clarence looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "That's the one worth writing down," he said. Karen wiped her eyes. Clarence went back to writing, and this time he didn't ask her to leave. Chapter 19. The Day of the Mural. The city of Maplewood had never been known for murals, but that changed the day artist Luis Navarro unveiled his latest work on the side of the downtown library. It featured a simple park bench, painted in vivid detail, and on it sat Clarence, notebook in hand, pen poised mid-thought. Behind him stretched a long quote in bold white letters. "I didn't ask to change the world. I only asked to sit and be seen." Clarence Miles. The unveiling drew a crowd of hundreds. Clarence stood quietly in the back, wearing the same Fisk University cap. When someone handed him a microphone, he hesitated. Then he stepped forward. "I didn't sit to start a movement," he said, "but maybe movements begin when people finally stop moving and listen." Thunderous applause followed, and just beneath the mural, a metal bench was installed, an exact replica of his, with a plaque dedicated to those whose stillness speaks louder than noise. Chapter 20. Karen Walks the Long Way. Karen didn't attend the mural unveiling. She couldn't. She felt like a ghost in a place she once ruled. But the mural became a turning point, not just for the town, but for her. She began walking every morning, past the bench, past the mural, past the schools where Clarence now sometimes read aloud to children. No phone, no clipboard, no commentary. She passed by people she once judged and chose not to speak. She was learning, and learning hurts. Chapter 21. The School Reading. Clarence visited Maplewood Middle School for a reading session organized by Chloe Tran, a 12-year-old student who had written an essay called "Silence Isn't Always Safe." The class gathered around him in the library. He read from a chapter titled "The Bus Stop," where he described being 15, waiting on a bench in Alabama, and being told to stand because boys like him didn't belong sitting that close to white girls. A girl raised her hand. "Mr. Miles, how do you stay calm when people treat you unfairly?" Clarence smiled. "I learned that sometimes dignity isn't in what you say, it's in what you don't let them take." Another boy asked, "Did you forgive the lady who called the cops?" Clarence looked out the window. A leaf drifted by. "Yes," he said, "because holding anger ties you to the same bench as hate, and I had writing to do." Chapter 22. The Book Signing. Clarence's publisher organized a signing at the local bookstore. They expected 50 people. Over 300 showed up. Lines curled around the block. People brought copies, notebooks, even blank pages for Clarence to sign. Some cried. Some said thank you. One young man whispered, "Your book made me call my grandfather for the first time in years." Then near the end of the line, Karen appeared. She held her copy of "To Sit and Be Seen" to her chest, eyes cast downward. When it was her turn, she said softly, "I bought 5 copies, gave them to my sisters." Clarence opened her book, paused, and wrote, "To Karen, because even the ones who watch can learn to see." She stared at the message for a long time. Then she hugged the book like it was a second chance. Chapter 23. National Stage. The following month, Clarence was invited to speak at a televised town hall hosted by PBS. He sat on a stage flanked by community leaders, educators, and civil rights advocates. When asked what change looked like, Clarence replied, "Change isn't loud. It isn't instant. It's one person sitting still long enough to recognize they were moving in the wrong direction." The moderator asked him about Karen, though they didn't name her. Clarence answered carefully, "She's part of the story, not the villain, not the hero, just someone still learning. And that's okay. We're all still learning." The audience applauded, and across the country, households who had never heard of Maplewood now knew the story of the man on the bench. Chapter 24. The Youth Group Bench Project. Inspired by Clarence, a local youth group started a campaign called the Bench Project. They painted and installed brightly colored benches around town with quotes from the book. Each one bore a simple sign: sit, reflect, see. They even gave Karen the honor of unveiling one near the elementary school. She did it humbly, without a speech. Instead, she sat silently as children around her talked and laughed. A little girl asked if she was the lady from the story. Karen smiled and said, "Yes, and I'm still rewriting my ending." Chapter 25. One Last Page. Back at the original park bench, where it all started, Clarence sat with his notebook again. This time, he wasn't writing his past. He was writing his closing chapter. Shadowing the pages were sentences of joy, of sorrow, of change. He ended the manuscript with a simple line: "When I sat on that bench, I thought I was alone. But I was never alone. I just needed the world to stop moving long enough to see me." He closed the notebook, looked up. Karen stood nearby with coffee and a quiet smile. She sat down beside him, and for the first time they simply sat. No cameras, no headlines, just stillness. Together. Chapter 26. The Library Dedication. Spring bloomed early in Maplewood. The air smelled like possibility and fresh-cut grass. That April, the public library unveiled its new reading wing, renovated through donations largely inspired by Clarence's memoir. Inside, on the largest wall, were the words, "Words are where silence heals. Benches are where silence speaks." Clarence Miles. There was a small ceremony. Clarence was the guest of honor. Karen arrived late, standing near the back in a pale blue scarf and quiet eyes. Clarence spotted her. He didn't say a word. Instead, when it was his turn to speak, he simply said, "I'm grateful for every person who saw me sitting and chose to listen before reacting. That includes those who got it wrong at first. Because the only thing more powerful than getting it right is choosing to do better after you didn't." Karen lowered her head and smiled. Chapter 27. A bench in every city. Months passed. To Sit and Be Seen was translated into 7 languages. The paperback hit #1 on multiple bestseller lists. Clarence gave fewer interviews now. He was never in it for fame. But one interview stood out. It was with a student-run radio station from Detroit. The host asked, "Mr. Miles, what's your dream now?" Clarence paused and said, "I want a bench in every city, not with my name on it. Just a place where someone like me can sit without fear, and someone like Karen can learn to look deeper." Within a year, 42 cities launched bench projects of their own. Chapter 28. Karen's New Role. Karen never returned to the HOA board. She didn't run for any leadership role. Instead, she started volunteering at the Community Writing Center, helping adults learn how to express themselves through stories. She didn't tell people who she had been. She let her actions speak. One day, a shy young man asked her, "Did you really know Clarence Miles in real life?" She smiled. "I sat beside him once, and then I sat beside him again, and again, until one day I realized I wasn't afraid anymore." Chapter 29. The Last Notebook. Clarence's health began to slow him down. He still walked, still wrote, but the energy wasn't what it once was. He started writing letters to be opened after he passed. One for his niece, one for the town library, and one for Karen. In Karen's letter, he wrote, "I forgave you the first day, but I saw you forgive yourself much later. That's when healing really started. Thank you for not running from your shame, but walking straight into it. You showed the world what redemption looks like sitting still." Chapter 30. The New Bench. A year later, Clarence Miles passed peacefully in his sleep, pen still resting beside an unfinished notebook. The town held a public memorial, but no speeches were needed. People gathered at the park bench where it all began. Karen sat down first, then a teacher, then a student, then a mother with her son. No one spoke. They just sat, quiet, still, present. A new plaque had been installed beneath the bench. It read, "This is not a memorial. This is a reminder. Sit, reflect, see, then rise and do better." And as the wind rustled through the trees, it sounded, for just a moment, like pages turning. Epilogue. Stillness. Forever. Years later, a child asked his father, "Why do we always sit on that bench in Maplewood?" The father smiled. "Because one man sat there so long, the world finally saw him." "But what did he do?" "He wrote." "And what did he write?" The father paused. "He wrote the truth." And in that still moment, beneath the shade of a quiet elm, the child sat, just like Clarence had, and the world kept moving. But now it moved with more kindness. The end.